Welcome, everybody. Welcome to the Icelandic Roots webinar. We're here to discuss the elves and bonfires in North America 150 years ago that happened between Christmas and New Year's Day, and discuss that tradition and also some of the lost traditions and folklore of the Western Icelanders. And I'm joined by Natalie Guttormsson. Do you want to introduce yourself, Natalie?
Sure. My name is Natalie, and I am a former volunteer with Icelandic Roots, and I currently live in Alberta, Canada. And I've been on the Snorri program, did the Snorri internship, and have volunteered with different organizations over the years. And I'm just really passionate about folklore, especially from Iceland and also Britain.
Great. Thank you. So one of the reasons I invited Natalie here to talk about this, probably the main reason is that she's a folklore expert. But a second reason is that both of our ancestors were at this New Year's Eve event 150 years ago. And uh, so I wanted us to talk about it and talk about um, what has changed since then. So around 150 years ago, Willow Point, Icelanders had landed at what now is known as Gimli, a little south of Gimli, and had set up camp. And here's a picture of both our ancestors. So mine is on the left, who was there, Sigurd Loig Magnus' daughter, and she came with the Kinmount group. This picture was taken in the late 1920s when she was an older woman, but she had arrived at Iceland when she was 21 years old. And Natalie, I don't know if you want to say something about your two ancestors that were there.
Yeah, well, actually, think about it now. I think um, Jon and Paulina came over with Vigfús, and then Guttormur was born in Canada. So I think he would have just either been an infant or maybe can't remember his birth year off the top of my head.
Right.
But in this photo, it was after Paulina had passed. So it's just Guttormur and Vigfús is my great 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 grandfather, the taller boy, and then their father Jon sitting down. They came from the east of Iceland, and a little bit of mystery about how they ended up where they were in Ontario because it wasn't with the group, but it might have been nearby. And they ended up joining as they went to Manitoba.
Yeah, so the Kinmount group had been there since for maybe a little less than a year. Things had fallen apart at Kinmount, but they'd regrouped and were headed to Gimli. And apparently, your family joined them on this trip
Mm-hmm.
that went from probably they may have joined them at Kinmount or they may have joined them probably at Ontario. I'm sorry, at Toronto, and went up the Great Lakes and then up the Red River to Gimli. And we know that on their on these tombstones, it says that they arrived at Willow Point on October 21st, 1875, which is the date that the Kinmount group also arrived. So they were with them.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So there are two events that happen at around January 1st and also and nowadays and also or sorry, December 31st and January 6th. Um, and this holiday called Threttándan, which means the 13th, marks the end of the Icelandic Christmas season. And nowadays that occurs on January 6th. But what's interesting is that it also represents the end of what is called Old Christmas. And that's a relic of the Julian calendar, which was replaced by the Gregorian calendar, which we use today. And around 1700, Iceland was one of the European countries that rather late in the game switched to the Gregorian calendar. And this shifted Christmas from January 5th to December 25th. So um, some people believe that Old Christmas, what came to be called Old Christmas, January 5th, at the end of Old Christmas, kind of led to the rise of Threttounden, the 13th. It was this kind of the end of this old time Christmas that had more maybe more mystique about it as a traditional Christmas. And so some traditions associated this shift. This is a shift from New Year's Eve to January 6th as kind of a second New Year's Eve, second celebration. So as we talk about whether this event 150 years ago happened on New Year's Eve or happened on January 6th, we don't actually know, but we know it was to bring in the new year. Do you want to say something about this slide and photo?
Yeah. So I actually had the pleasure of taking in a New Year's Eve bonfire in Iceland. I was living there with my family from fall of 2019 to summer of 2021. So Christmas season, we got to experience the full magic of what it can be in Iceland in 2019. Um, and so this is a picture from a New Year's Eve bonfire. If you are gonna ever go to Iceland at this time of year, just Google a map of where the bonfires are and they'll tell you. But from what I understand, this is one of the bigger ones in Eyjafjalla. So it's not far from the lake, not far from the university, and it's right on the beach. And I was telling Jason earlier that they were collecting trees and furniture and crates and pallets for about a week. And in typical Icelandic weather, it drizzled all week long. So on New Year's Eve, it took a long time to get this fire started. A lot of fire starter, a lot of blow torches, and eventually it lit up and there were fireworks going off all around and a lot of locals, a lot of tourists, though, too. So, from what I understand, New Year's Eve bonfires are bigger and you get a lot more tourists coming. And then the January 6th bonfires for Threttanden is a little bit smaller, more family friendly, and more locals that go to that. But that's jumping ahead to
Interesting.
today.
And also, there's a guy there in the picture with a bucket. What was that gasoline they had he was throwing on the
Oh,
fire there?
yes. Yeah. So this is like moments after it finally went up in flames
Uh,
and then it was excited. And I think we were probably out there for an hour. And I mean, I was carrying our 2-year-old on my back. So we weren't out there for the full night. And we didn't go to the January 6th one because I just don't think we were feeling well. And being out there so late in the drizzly cold, we thought, oh, we'll skip it.
yeah.
Sadly, next year there were no bonfires due to the pandemic, but maybe someday I'll get to go.
And the ground looks very wet. And you and I were talking about
Yeah.
how it might have been difficult to get these bonfires started in in the 19th century because they didn't have all the tools that we have today to do that.
Yeah. I would imagine they'd be much smaller.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So this is really the fun part, looking at folklore, legends and beliefs and traditions, because they're really fascinating and magical when you look at Icelandic folklore. So the time between Christmas and New Year's and Tretandin, it's a time when it's very dark. It's the longest, darkest days of the entire year. Um, the sun will come up at maybe 10 o'clock and it's going down at by 3. So it really is dark for a long time. If you're further north, you might not even see the sun. Um, so this is the time of year when it's believed that the human world and supernatural worlds are blurring. It's a liminal space. And so there's been stories collected from around Iceland of all these strange and unusual things that can happen. It is said that cows can gain the ability to speak. I've even heard that they'll speak in poetry and rhymes. And if you overhear them, it can often drive the person mad. So you don't really want to hear
Wow.
it because you might not be able to tell anyone about it. But
And the
that's
cows
one thing.
speak in Hebrew, it says. That sometimes they speak in Hebrew, I guess.
I think it's you see in the folklore like a blending of the supernatural and spiritual, but then there's always like religious influences too.
Hmm.
So it's a very it's a time to be on your toes. It's also said that seals or seal people or other countries call them selkies. It's a time of year that they will come ashore and take off their seal skins because they're also human at special times of the year and they will dance on the beach without clothes. They're naked. And if you stumble upon them, it might be bad luck for you. There are Icelandic folk tales about um, men who have stolen a seal skin so that they can lure a seal woman to be their wife on land. Lots of thoughts on that, but that's another webinar.
Yeah.
um, Dreams are said to be really meaningful at this time of year. So if you pay attention to what you're dreaming about on this night, it can maybe tell you your future or bring you good luck or reveal something. And that also has ties to Christianity. In other cultures, January 6th is known as the Epiphany. Well, in Iceland too, in Christianity, it's the Epiphany. And the revelation of the birth of Jesus to the three wise men is kind of where that belief in the power of dreams comes from. And then it's also said New Year's and on this day, which is probably because of the shifting calendars, it's the time of year when elves are on the move. So you want to, there's like, there's a little poem you can say to basically welcome them in your home and then invite them to leave so that you don't interrupt them or bring bad luck on yourself. But you know that you might encounter elves on this night. And yeah, hidden knowledge can be revealed either through dreams or visions. And there's multitudes of stories, but one example, a farmer discovering a shepherd's secret winter valley, and then he was cursed for his curiosity because he should not have been spying and finding out those
Ah.
important details.
It's interesting to me the Christian idea of that God and man intersected, you know, 2000 years ago, 2024 years ago, and uh Christ was born, and that there was this kind of intersection between the spiritual world
Mm,
and the material world, and but the Icelandic threatened and kind of relives that every year, right? It kind of like goes back and says, okay, now it's open again. And
mm,
some of the folklore, even that, especially like that last story you told, is like to strengthen your moral character in a way. It's like this very vivid, colorful story that strengthens how you should live. And I think it's kind of interesting that this holiday kind of maybe is trying to strengthen that idea of there being a spirit world and that there was this intersection by having it happen every year. Maybe. I don't know. That's just
yeah.
a conjecture, but
But since you mentioned that, like
yeah.
moral fortitude, I can't remember if it's on the next slide or maybe I forgot to include it in the points, but one of the tales that I enjoy is that there's this belief that if you lie down at a crossroads
Hmm.
and you spend the entire night until the sun comes up and you resist any temptation. So if you do this, you're supposed to be visited by all these partying elves who offer things like amazing food or liquor or wealth or, you know, romance. And if you resist it all, then you will have really good luck and prosperity will come to you. But if you give in, you'll be driven mad and you'll be sick and your life is downhill from there.
Yeah.
And there's a tale in Jon Anderson's book about a man who gets so close to the dawn, and then he's tempted with like his favorite food, and he's just so hungry he can't resist, so he doesn't make it.
Uh-oh.
But it's that just persevere, don't do anything bad, don't give it a drink, don't
Yeah.
be faithful, and all this stuff. So
Super
yeah,
interesting. All
but
right. Go ahead. Yeah,
One of
sorry.
the big symbols of both New Year's and Tretton is those bonfires. And again, it's dark, long, cold nights. Having a bonfire lights up the literally the neighborhood or the community, you know, go back in time to before electric lights. It would make such a difference to have a communal fire at this time of year to ward off those elves that are coming to tempt you and just that thinness between spirit world and our world. And to this day, we'll get more into it, but there is a tradition on the January 6th, 13th day to honor the king and queen of the elves or the fairy king and queen by singing songs and dancing around the fire. And it's more of a friendly as opposed to a fearful celebration these days. And
Interesting.
anyone who has heard of the Yule Lads, we know that there's 13 days leading up to Christmas that they arrive one by one, causing mayhem. And then they also leave one by one after Christmas. And so the 6th is the final day for the last one. Cut to sneaker, candle beggar, or candle swiper goes home, and then you're safe from their mischief until next year.
Sounds pretty good.
Yeah.
All
And then
right. Oh,
also,
go ahead.
yeah, it's supposed to be the end of the Christmas season. So by January 6th, I mean, if you have a real tree, you go put it on the bonfire. If you have fig tree, you take it down and eat the leftovers, basically clean up and get ready to go back to work, go back to school, and start the new year off right. The only thing I know that Icelanders keep up is the lights outside. So, like white lights on trees will stay up pretty much, I think, till February, which
Hmm.
is really nice because it is
Yeah,
very, very dark. But yeah.
that's great.
So
So, yeah,
modern traditions, yeah, it's a time to feast and play and connect with family and friends. And um, from my comparison of growing up in Canada, and I know it's very similar in the US to Iceland, is Iceland really knows how to take a break. They know how to have a holiday and how to rest. And I think that's something to be learned from modern Iceland. Back in the day, it would have been a lot different because you're just trying to survive all year round. But it's a time to eat chocolate and read books and burn candles and just enjoy yourself.
that sounds
And
great.
a big part of modern tradition is the fireworks. So I think of fireworks, I do think of New Year's, but I also think of like Canada Day, which is just a few days before Independence Day. In Iceland, because it doesn't get dark in the summer, there's no point in doing fireworks because you can't see them. But in the darkness, oh, it's magical. And they have a rule that leading up to Christmas is the only time of year you can buy fireworks, and
Hmm.
all the profits go towards the search and rescue teams. It's their big fundraiser of the year. And then I think it's from New Year's Eve until Threatenden is the only time you can set them off. And
Interesting.
thousands and thousands and thousands of fireworks go off. So it's a
Much
some
bigger
people
than
love it, some people hate it.
yeah, much bigger than the 4th of July in the United States, I think even.
Yeah,
Just like lots of fireworks.
there's the pros, and then there's like every other house in every neighborhood
Yeah.
firing them off on the beach in their backyard. Uh,
Wow.
yeah, it's noisy. It's very noisy.
All right. So what I thought I'd do is read a little bit about this bonfire that happened in 1875 at Willow Point. Um, so this is from the diary of Seaman Seaman who it was published in 1919, but he was with the Kinmount Group, and he'd written about in his diary about their experiences, including this bonfire. And he says, between Christmas and New Year, we carried dry wood out on the lake to build a huge pyre for the burning out of the old year. On New Year's Eve, the night was still and extremely frosty. The fire was lit, and soon as the blaze gave sufficient, men and women, as many as were able to, thronged on the scene. William Taylor, who was the sort of the guide of the Western Icelanders to Gimli from Kinmount, was then about 60 years old of age and was dressed up to impersonate the old year. He was a sight to behold in his apparel. He wore a tar paper hat, 2 feet high or better, a beard of hair of rabbit fur, which you can see to the right, and a white smock so voluminous as to make him a giant. He had a walking stick and carried a bottle of and a wine glass. The latter he passed around freely, but there was a rub. The bottle was empty. He was very witty, and his entertainment was good. Finally, he carried away and disappeared from the story. Then the 12 New Year's Eve elves appeared on the scene, clad in white and decked in rose red ribbons. They acted in their various comic scenes. Then the people returned to their homes, thinking the entertainment was a success. None had far to go, and there was plenty of wood for heating the shacks, which was all to the good, for the frost was very severe. So um, that's the event that happened, and there were elves dancing and comic scenes, elves playing out comic scenes, which I think is interesting. And then in this part, I think we'll just explore. I'll have you start us off here. What's the origin of this? We can't really get to the bottom of it, but we can we have some information.
Mhm.
What's the origin of these bonfires and of these elf dances?
Yeah. Before we dig into that, you just sparked two thoughts
Hmm.
reading that story again, hearing it. One is that the 12 fairies or elves that come and they have comic scenes.
Yeah.
Another modern tradition that I really enjoy that Iceland does is they have their it's called Áramótaskaupið. It's like
Hmm.
a comedy special. It's like an
Oh, right,
hour and a
right.
half long
Yeah.
where they're really well done, where they have, I mean, think of it like SNL but not live, where they
Hmm.
have
Hmm.
skits that make fun of events from the year.
Yeah.
And you can find it on YouTube usually like a week after New Year's. They'll put it up and sometimes with subtitles. Um, so that idea of reminiscing the year that passed and poking fun and laughing is something that they still do
Yeah.
today.
That's good. That's a good point. Yeah.
Yeah. And then just also to contrast, um, this group of Icelanders would have been in Ontario, but I don't think they were there for a full year. I'm not sure. But to go from Iceland, where it gets cold, yes, and the wind is brutal and the humidity just like soaks into your bones, but to a prairie winter, like
Much colder.
where you walk out of your house and your face hurts
Yeah.
because it's so cold.
Right.
And then if it's windy, I mean, I live in central northern Alberta, so I can speak to that.
Yeah.
It would have been a
That's
big
like,
shock.
yeah, the polar vortex that
Yeah.
is there every winter. Yeah. Much
So,
colder. Yeah. If you look at the winter temperatures, it gets a lot colder on the prairie than it does in Iceland.
yeah, so that alone would have been a very big shock. So I can imagine they wouldn't have been out for too long, but they still had fun. So good for them. Yeah, so but the big question is where do these traditions come from? How long have they been celebrated in certain ways? And what have we maybe lost here as Western Icelanders versus what is thriving in Iceland today? And so we've tried to do a little bit of research, and there's only so much you can find in free resources, I guess, or um, without doing a ton of research into Icelandic texts. We did find some information about an early New Year's Eve bonfire celebration. 1791, schoolboys from Hólavallaskóli in Reykjavik um, held a bonfire that's thought to be one of the first, maybe the first. But by the 1840s, we know that bonfires were more commonplace because there's more mentions of them. And it's interesting that to divert teens and young people from gathering downtown and causing trouble, they issued permits for suburbs to host them. And today the downtown would be way too risky to have a fire, so it
Yeah.
makes sense.
That's right.
They are in the suburbs. I know Seltjarnarnes has one somewhere. ISC that has one, and I'm sure the other suburbs have them now too. Um, yeah, that'd be just much safer, even though Reykjavik has grown so much in 150 years. But yeah,
Yeah.
and then
So,
yeah,
oh, yeah.
go
So,
ahead.
the first documented bonfire that involved elf dances was in 1872. So only a few years before the event in 1875 at Willow Point. And schoolboys from Menta School and the Learned School, known nowadays as Reykjavik Junior College, if you're up on the top by Hallgrímskirkja, it would be, if you're facing the church, it would be to your left and before you go down the hill. And they held a bonfire incorporating elves and elf dances. Um, However, it was closer to the Sonora Edda than it was to folklore because they grouped themselves into light elves and dark elves, and they carried torches and sang throughout the city and marched to the Tjornin Pond. And so I just want to mention that I think that these elf dances were probably happening long before 1872, or at least some time before, because it's doubtful that these schoolboys 3 years before the Willow Point event had inspired folks from northern Iceland to do
Mhm.
elf dances, that this it just probably wasn't written down, and we just don't know. But this is what we see when we look in the literature.
Yeah. Can you go back one slide just
Yes,
for a
for
moment,
sure.
Jason?
Yeah.
No, that's a very good point. And what we would think is newsworthy to report on, if it's just the normal thing, it's not newsworthy.
Yeah. That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
And
Um,
also the point about the bonfires we were talking about, you and I, before it started, about how there wasn't any trash collection, and so it was probably common, or at least word of mouth, although it's not written down, was
mhm,
that people would, since the Middle Ages, hold bonfires to sort of get rid of all their items that were in disuse that they no longer needed, particularly people like fishermen and things like that.
mhm. And you've got the great arrow pointing at the Mentascoli.
Yeah.
That church there that's also visible by the pond, like
Hmm.
that's still there today. So if you walk around the pond, I think it's the west side of it.
Oh, you're right. That is, yeah.
You'll see that church and you'll still see the Mentascoli there. It's no longer a boys only school. It's high school for um anybody. But yeah, you've probably,
Yeah.
if you've been downtown Reykjavik, you've walked past those
Yeah.
two buildings.
That's so interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Oh, hold on a second. There you go.
Yeah. So, I mean, the exact initial purpose of a bonfire, maybe there's no answer per se, but we can theorize like burning of things is like a practice that many cultures have used to for cleansing and getting rid of practical things that you can't repair, can't use anymore. Um, I mean, to this day, some places still burn garbage, so it's you wouldn't want to be near it though. And as you said, yeah, fishermen have burned old possessions to make room for new ones, and the new year is a fresh start. It's a time of renewal, and in the darkness, it's also really good to have a light source. So, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, okay, so this is your slide. Go
This is my slide.
ahead. Sorry.
That's a big one.
It is a big
That's a
one. I
big
was
one.
taking a breath
And
there.
yeah, I mean, there's a common theme of lost traditions. And as Western Icelanders, there's things that get passed on sometimes and sometimes not, and what might be some of the reasons for this. So I know I'm a millennial to date myself, and when I went into the Snorri program, I was fascinated and just surprised by how much I didn't know about Iceland, like historically or contemporary culture. And so then I would learn the new stuff, and then I would go read old books and go, oh, wow, things don't line up. So these are sort of, I guess, speculations and ideas. And if you are watching or listening and you have ideas because maybe you're closer to your grandparents or you remember your great grandparents, I think it'd be say we'd love to have feedback or stories shared. But I think it's very common that for the late 1800s, early 1900s, other cultures coming into, especially Canada, there's a pressure to fit in to the predominantly British culture. So if they're bringing over beliefs in elves, there could be a desire not to bring that in because it's different, it's seen as other. Or it could even be that maybe they didn't feel it came with them. Maybe they feel like they left it behind in the home country. And then also that point about the boys having their bonfire with the elves in this, was it 1872?
Hmm.
Jon Arneson's collection was first printed in the 1860s. So there's like this resurgence of pride in Iceland having a distinct culture and folklore that might be rising in Reykjavik, but maybe not reaching the outer parts of the country as people are leaving. So it's it's hard to know exactly what people knew if they're not explicitly writing it down or passing it on to the next generation. But some of the things I know have been kept, whether it's not the elf dances or the supernatural beliefs of New Year's Eve, is things like having dinners, having feasts with family, going to dances. So maybe they're not dancing around a bonfire because it's too cold. They're going inside to a dance hall and having dances. So, yeah, those are just some of the reasons I would say that some of these traditions didn't stay or didn't go with our ancestors and therefore didn't get passed down to us.
And you brought up this idea that they were the Scandinavians were big adapters to different cultures. I thought that was super interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I would say Icelanders, but also like Norwegians and Swedish people, wherever they move to, they're very good at blending in, like losing their accent if they need to, and picking up new cultures. And it's not just the modern Nordic people, it's the Vikings. Because if you look at any incredible map of how far Vikings went, they went deep into Russia, they went into the Middle East. We know they went into Britain and Normandy of France. And we know historically they were there. And there's probably place names that were influenced by Nordic language, but culturally, they became farmers in Britain. They became part of Russian culture. You know, they adapt really well and they sort of disappear as like a distinct Nordic culture. So
Yeah.
I can see that happening in North America too, especially as people kept moving south and west.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Um, so we've talked about a lot of this stuff, the role of immigration, suppressing traditions, trying to fit in. Um, we've compared the historical accounts to modern practices, which are somewhat similar. And again, we don't know the exact date of the event, if it was on the January 6th or if it was New Year's Eve, as we modern people celebrated on December 31st. Um, and what one thing that you brought up was, what is worth reviving and what is worth adapting to contemporary culture. And you said the idea of taking a break, really taking a break, that we don't actually do that, which I think is a good point. Are there other things you think are worth reviving? You don't have to have a yes answer to that. I'm just curious.
Well, this is just a selfish personal wish. As I was growing up, Canada also used to do a New Year's Eve like comedy special because we used to have this show called
Hmm.
the Royal Canadian Air Farce.
Oh yeah,
I
yeah.
remember it would culminate with a chicken cannon, and they would take the most newsworthy events or like people in the news, and they would stuff all kinds of gross things in a cannon and then shoot it at, a picture of the prime minister or a celebrity or something. And it was so funny. And that hasn't been done in a long time, or if it has, someone correct me and tell me where to watch it. But I don't know, just I think reflecting on the year that's passed, and I mean, could use a little more magic, I think.
Yeah. And I mean, what you're bringing up is coming together, people coming together,
Yeah,
reflect on the year as was done with the bonfire, and could be done in modern times in a different way.
yeah. Maybe unplugging.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate having you, and you can hear my dog barking in the background, but
In
um,
true winter Alberta fashion, I don't know if you guys could hear the grader that went by my window, but they're clearing
I,
snow.
I couldn't hear it. No.
Zoom's pretty good at filtering,
Yeah.
but yeah.
All right. Thank you for coming. And where can we find your some of your writing and folklore? Do you have a website?
Yeah, I do. I'm working on some blog posts now, but I also like to rewrite folk tales. So I have short stories, and it's just my full name, natalieguttormsson.com.
All right. Well,
Thanks
thanks
for
so much,
organizing,
Natalie.
Jason.
Yeah, absolutely.